I would like to maybe just kickstart it a little bit, and noticing from all the little presentations we had, we kind of understand nostalgia as, and I think Ben said this, that when you think about it, it started off almost like as a medical symptom, and so does that then make our nostalgia, Singaporeans being nostalgic, or anyone being nostalgic, almost seeking some kind of a balm, all right, for an illness that's within us, some kind of, I don't know, to ease a pain in there somewhere, and that's been mentioned across the board. There's some kind of pain, dissatisfaction with the present, and hopefully the past can bring that future. What maybe Ben, you want to talk a little bit about that, and we can then open to the floor for any questions from that strain.
Yeah, I'm just trying to work out that one. So yeah, the originally nostalgia was essentially a kind of diagnosis of depression. It was like these soldiers were depressed. They'd been away for years fighting, and they were kind of miserable and didn't want to get out of bed. And so it was a diagnosis of them desperately wanting to go home and having these memories of home and sort of wanting to access them. And I think, going back to the point I was talking about with old places, the point I was trying to make about old places, so when you look at that film, you see this kind of incredible yearning for the past that's almost overwhelming, and it's rhythmic, it's repetitive, it just goes on and on and on, and there's just all of these different places, and when one finishes, another one begins, and it's almost like this kind of endless cycle. And when I saw the film, and it was actually shown on National Day, 2010, it was like a National Day special, which was interesting in and of itself. I thought it was almost not really a film, it was like an installation. You could imagine it being in a gallery, just playing for days on a loop. And then they made another film, Old Romances, which was a sort of follow-up, and there's an interview somewhere online where Royston says that they would like to do a third one. So it's almost like you could just keep making these films. I also worried, and I didn't put this in the presentation because it's a bit cheeky, that some people who maybe are at these spaces, people in, say, an old coffee shop, when they see Royston and his camera crew showing up, it's like, please don't film us, because if you do, we'll probably get shut down or upgraded a couple of weeks later. It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more you sentimentally document the past, the more you almost erase it. But I think that as I was looking at old places, and as I said in the presentation, it's like the absolute hardcore of nostalgia. I saw that there was anger there. It felt actually that beneath this kind of calm surface of memories, that there was actually a real anger. And I think, that has been articulated in interviews about the project. An anger, and this may speak to your point, Karen, about the balm or a certain kind of pain. An anger about losing control of the present, or losing control of the future, or not having a stake in the future, in the sense that the upgrading programs and Marina Bay Sands and all of the new developments that are so kind of overhyped in a way, they're not things that we have strong feelings about as people who live in Singapore. Because they're kind of out of our control. Whereas old places are places that we can kind of return to for real, if they're still around, or in our memories and our imaginations, and we can kind of have some sort of control or power over them in terms of accessing the past, or just being in them and experiencing them. So I think, yeah, there's this is something that Bee Thiam was touching on as well, about sort of the what you call kind of violating nostalgia, or kind of angry nostalgia. And it's interesting that nostalgia, in the context of Singapore, nostalgia can seem like one thing, which is this rather sweet looking back at the past, but perhaps that masks actually an anger about the present and the direction of the future.
So maybe from members of the audience, do you then feel that same way? Do you have a question for the panel that perhaps maybe you have a thought about nostalgia and how you feel towards that? given that this is SG50 and you've been bombarded, all around you about different aspects of Singapore in the past and for the, what you want for the future. How do you respond to nostalgia? What's your thoughts on that?
But if you can hear me, I just want to know the thoughts of the speakers. What you think about the sweet romanticizing or the commodification of nostalgia? How restaurants or coffee shops built with old artifacts. I mean, it helps to sell things. Or films like It's a Great World, or maybe even old places, old places, people can afford to see them. Yeah. So I just want to know the thoughts on that. Absolutely.
Talk about Yakut. No, I was just whispering to Bee Thiam that actually in the MediaCorp did a documentary on the closing down of Tong Ya, Kopitiam in Yongxiak Road, and which has now become a very high-end hamburger joint. Even though the name Tong Ya is still on the building itself, and the Kopitiam actually have moved across the road into an air-conditioned room. But I mean, I'm not sure that the filmmakers of the film that I can imagine really has commodification in mind. Because I don't think they're trying to sell those places, because most of those places they're talking about are actually dead space already. I mean, they're actually memory, rather than, being rejigged into sort of restaurants. I mean, the clientele that go to the hamburger joint that pays $18 for hamburger, it's not the same people who eat kaya toast at Tong Ya. I mean, they might be on the same street, but they're not the same people, right? So actually, and in fact, I mean, I don't see any of this sort of attempt to make money from nostalgia in any of the films I have in mind. In fact, I was quite unhappy with The Great World, because it was so poorly done in terms of actually reconstructing Great World. Nothing of Great World was actually constructed. I mean, I used to go to the Great World when I was a kid, a lot, because I actually live from Bukit Ho Swee to Great World is like a 20 minutes walk. And there were 3 movie houses there, and I used to go to movies from 9 o'clock to about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, because it cost like 50 cents every show. So, and there was absolutely nothing in of Great World in that movie. So I don't see, at least in this particular case, I don't see the commodification. Of course, it's possible, but I want to pick up something that Bee Thiam said that is quite interesting. I think to a certain extent, depending on the context, nostalgia is in some sense utopian, all right, rather than about the past. Precisely because it's very selective. It's a reconstruction that has no reality, okay? And that particular reconstruction, in some sense, expresses a desire for a certain life, which is not here, and definitely not in the past. So in that sense, I mean, in Bee Thiam's words, it will be a nostalgia that empowers, in that if that particular construction, right, is utopian, and if that then motivates you to strive for its realization, even though you're using material from the past. Because it's actually very difficult to imagine the future. It's actually easier to repackage a future from resources at hand, which is also historical material. Right? So in that sense, I think that there is that utopian possibility rather than having no future in that sense. I mean, I think a lot of sentimentality. And this is really difficult. I mean, the 4 words, they are very difficult to deal with. One is history, the other one is memory, the other, then sentimentality. and then nostalgia. I mean, it's almost impossible to often untangle. Even political history is often difficult to untangle. I mean, the most debated political history, right, in the last while is really who is a communist, including Tan Bin Bin's film, right? Who is a communist? I mean, and you know, there are people who talk about the 60s with huge nostalgia of a possible future Singapore. I mean, the government's line is always that had PAP did not win the election, did not win the struggle against the communists, it will be a different world. Yes, it will be different. Will it? But it never said how different, whether it's a better different or a worse different. It just assumed that it will be a worse different. But people who write about the 60s would argue otherwise, right? So I think it's very, so all those four words that actually keep coming up whenever you talk about history are very difficult to untangle, right? Because they slide into each other all the time.
Question there.
Okay, question for the panel is, okay, we've seen a lot of nostalgia in Singapore film. I think that's one of like the main feature of Singapore film, to me lah. So my question is, how do you think nostalgia hamper and or inspire a construction of a Singapore identity or a Singapore film identity? Yep.
Maybe Bee Thiam.
What's the Singapore film identity?
It's such a loaded question. I think, especially with the filmmakers that I work with, it is something that we think a lot about. Of other films that was made, in Singapore for the last 20 years, especially, we find films that are predominantly Chinese speaking, of Chinese people, and I think that's why if you look at films that we have made, in the last 5 years especially, we try to balance it. We try to portray what we think, is Singapore to us, but we would not say that it is a Singapore, it is the identity for Singaporean films. But I think we are trying to create what we think it should be. So if you look at, say for example, a film like Snake Skin, it is primarily in English. Or even a film that we just completed, Fundamentally Happy, it is in English, between a Chinese boy and a Malay woman. And I think that is missing. So when we talk about nostalgia, just very much like when I spoke about Pontianak, it is obviously a Singapore, a Southeast Asian film, but we also find a lot of investors who come to us and say, I really like your film, I want to invest, but can you make it in Chinese? Or can you cast perhaps a well-known, Chinese actress, so that we can sell the film. So I think, answering perhaps David's question about, the value of heritage, there is that part of the value of heritage and nostalgia, but also I think how the current generation would want to think of it today. Yeah. So we hear a lot of people telling us, oh, but the Malay, audience is only so little. Are you sure you're going to cast a Malay actress in Malay language? But that is never a problem, right? I mean, one of the reasons why we want to do it this way and using a genre film like a horror film is we don't think that we would have that question, because when you watch a Thai horror film or a Japanese horror film, you don't ask the Japanese horror film to have a Chinese cast or to speak in English or something. No, it's okay to be in Japanese, it's okay to be in Thai. But when we are trying to make a Malay horror film, that is the question that we get. I don't know whether is it because they have been accustomed to the kind of Singaporean films that they have seen before, or it is what the current generation of Singaporean audience will be looking for, that perhaps the investor think that they would know better. Yeah, so I think the question of identity is, I think, very political, but at the same time very interesting and challenging for us when we think about financing and when we think of resources. Yeah. So I think that's what we have experienced for me to share.
Who are the Malay filmmakers or consultants or something that you have in Pontianak, for example? Because it always seems strange to me that Chinese filmmakers in Singapore are the ones telling the stories of Malay films or Indian films. Like, for example, I always wonder to myself, where are all the minority filmmakers who are making films about their own heritage in Singapore or within Southeast Asia? And it always seems like it's the Chinese filmmakers that pick up the mantle and speak for other races. Like Eric did the Tamil film, You Fundamentally Happy, for example. It's two Chinese directors. And like you also, like you just said, Pontianak, it's about Malay heritage, but it's with you and Glenn. So can you just speak a bit about how do you go about this kind of things?
Well, I think it is an interesting question that we get not too quite frequently, right? I think we think of filmmaking not just as the director, but with who we collaborate with. So I think, when you look at a film like Fundamentally Happy, it would be impossible to make the film without our actress Adiba Noor. And we see Adiba Noor as a filmmaker like us to make the films with us. If you look at a film like, Snake Skin, again, we have collaborators who are of other races, which is why they are speaking different languages. Yeah, so I think we need to broaden and expand, I think, our definition of who owns the film or who is behind the film, beyond a producer and a director. And I think that was really how we approach filmmaking. Of course, there are, Malay filmmakers out there, who are doing great work, right? Like Sanif Oleg, who represented Singapore, who was in the Oscars last year with Di Sayang. But we cannot force them, right, to make a film of this nature or that nature, right? It is up to them to pick up those materials. But why is it that we are interested to make them, right? It's because obviously it means something to us as well, and that's how we approach it.
And maybe to pick up that point, I'm sorry, it's just the point that when we look at, say, a iconic thing or genre of film like Pontianak, I don't see it so much as a Malay heritage film, but rather something that's quite unique to our region, Singapore, Southeast Asia in general. So I think if we look at it as a Singapore, as a country and a country of people, that sort of loses its racial sort of boundaries. We see it more like it being part of our culture, and so I think maybe if we thought of it through that lens, then we wouldn't have to worry so much as to who in particular, which race in particular takes up that sort of tells that story. I mean, I think maybe with 50 years on, we're hoping that would, sort of our identity as a country would then become more solidify itself, I suppose. I'm not sure. But coming back to the question of nostalgia, somebody over here had a question. Was there a hand raised? Chi Tian. Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
I think I'd like to ask this question about language, because whenever you try to delve into a past environment in Singapore, and of course this multilingual country, in terms of film, when you are making a film, there is restriction on the use of language, and right from TV series like The Awakening, it's very strange to find people from China coming and speaking Mandarin all the way, and it's already a reconstruction. It's unreal. I suppose what you find in Great World is Kelvin Tong's trying to reconstruct a multilingual environment. I think he probably had to create a lot of other crazy scenes about Great World just to finally have 11 minutes of a lot of dialect. And I remember even in the production, Brian Wong and this other guy had to speak Hainanese, but the problem was their Hainanese were different kinds of Hainanese, and they had to work very hard. Brian Wong's mother had to sort of teach the other actor to use the particular kind of Hainanese, so that there will never be any sort of reality if you want to go back to a kind of a linguistic construction of the past anyway in Singapore. And and even to the point that Singlish is used for so long that by now it's got different stages of Singlish. I was very horrified when in Mata Mata, they were speaking such a bad level of English that was used in 1970s. So I mean, terms like cannot make it is not a 1970s term. Just like if you make a film in 2014 and you use stun like vegetable, it will be sort of anachronistic. So there's this different stages of even Singlish that we really have to be now sensitive of, even if we are doing these kinds of nostalgic films. So there's no real attentiveness given to this idea of multilingual, the language, and how in fact then it's reconstructed even as nostalgia in film in Singapore. I mean, that's probably more of a comment, but maybe you'd like to speak about that.
I think it's, we were talking earlier, Beng, before it began, about how a lot of the things that people are nostalgic about are actually not that far in the past. And, and Beng Huat was saying he went to the worlds, he went to the great world. So I think it's entirely possible to, given resources and research and talking to people, it's entirely possible to authentically recreate those things. It's just difficult, and it's been, and it's obviously been contested, like you were saying. It was almost like, I haven't seen the whole film properly, I don't think It's a Great, Great World, but you were saying it was almost like Kelvin had constructed the whole film just to have that one section. Oh, right, yeah, okay, so that section was the sort of, the section with dialects, and obviously, dialects are controversial simply because, well, I don't think there's ever, I don't think anyone's ever said the percentage as an official rule, but yeah, obviously dialects are highly contested in terms of how much you can use anyway, so it's complicated, but I think it can be done, the authentic recreation could be done, and I guess that, I don't want to keep going back to Pontianak, but I guess that, that there's also a language issue there about how people will speak and how they will sound like. That point that you made, Chikin, about Singlish is really interesting because, the film that I've done a lot of work sort of studying and researching is Saint Jack, and there are Singaporean characters, Singaporean Malaysian actors who are kind of not really professional actors in that film, talking to each other in Singaporean English from 1978, and it sounds very different to Singlish, and the term Singlish didn't even exist then. It was just known in the media as Singapore English, and there would be letters of complaint to the Straits Times about there's too much Singapore English. But I think it was Sylvia Chu who came up with the expression Singlish, which was probably some point in the early 80s, so it hadn't yet been codified. So it is interesting to see how these things evolve, and then they sort of become these touchstones for a kind of nostalgic access to a past that actually isn't very far away, and people are here to tell us about it and to recreate it if we want to.
Okay, we probably have about 5 more minutes, so I just would like to ask the floor if they have any more questions, to please. No, if not, I actually wanted to close with a question actually for the panel or for the audience to maybe think about. Given that this is our 50th anniversary, 50th birthday, what happens after SG50? I mean, if people would have thought about, would people continue to be nostalgic, or do you think it's all just going to die down and we'll go back to our own lives and forget about the future? Yeah, or the future of nostalgia, yeah. So do you have any thoughts on this? Or if the audience has a comment on that as well? Yeah.
I think the interesting thing that Shikin pointed out is about authenticity. And it is about recreating something, not just perhaps the set, not just the costume, not just the language, but how do you recreate something that is authentic, that people agree that this is indeed what has happened? That of course will cost a lot of money, but I think implicit in that as well. Once you have, say for example, the most perfect recreation of what has happened in the past, then what? Does it mean then that it pacifies the audience that okay, now that it has been created, it has been preserved, that it is then now time to move on, right? Almost as if the kind of preservation work that we are doing now in terms of documenting Bukit Brown, in terms of documenting this and that, One, it is perfect, it is time to move on. So I think there was that kind of passivity, right, in nostalgia and in preservation as well, that I myself am wary, because I feel that nostalgia can be more productive than that. Yeah.
I don't think as a sentiment it will ever go away. I mean, so whether we're in 50 years, 100 years of history, it was a sentiment that will never go away. And I mean, it's also quite interestingly intergenerational. For example, it's not just like one generation being nostalgic about its own past, but to a certain extent, I think in Singapore it's quite interesting, and this happens, I mean, not just in Singapore. For example, in the US, a lot of young people in the US is very nostalgic for the 60s. They don't know what it is. All they have is, what they read and what they saw, and even the horrible Vietnam War and all that. And so it's a nostalgia for, as you say, it's a nostalgia for an experience not of your own, but of somebody else's, which is like by now 2 generations old, right? So I think I think we will go through that in Singapore. I think because the future of Singapore is pretty well, so I mean in the next 20 years you kind of could see its physical environment and all otherwise. Even the sort of, ironically, this kind of outpouring of mourning for Lee Kuan Yew has a certain sort of sense of a past that a lot of people who line up there didn't know what that past really is. All right, but I mean, the irony is a lot of people say he was a great man, then you say, well, what's so great about him? And they can't say anything. You just say, well, he spent his whole life for Singapore, right? So did Cha Tai Po spend his whole life for Singapore. I mean, so I think this kind of nostalgia is it's generationally transferred. So I don't think it will be something that disappears. It just, each generation might create its own path of, and how far back they want to go. And in Singapore, the history really is truly very shallow. I mean, you can, maybe in some future day even now we're already trying to revive Temasek, right? Really desperately. I mean, and most people didn't know this is like 14th century, right? Between Temasek and Raffles, there was nothing.
Okay. Yep.
Just a quick one. I think, just to add what people are saying, yeah, I think obviously nostalgia never goes away. There's kind of always a part of us that seeks it out. It kind of gives us pleasure. It gives us comfort. And that's a universal thing. You were saying about young people being obsessed with the 60s now. I mean, I think we were always obsessed with the 60s. I was obsessed with the 60s in the late 80s, early 90s. It's just one of those utopian constructions that you wish you could be part of and go back to. And the culture allows you to access it vicariously. But I think in Singapore, nostalgia will be used. It will be used to sell food, and it'll be used to make us watch TV programs. Well, not that many of us watch TV programs, but it will continue to be commodified. I think that is a fair point. Not necessarily in film, because no one makes money in film in Singapore. Maybe 1 or 2 people do. But I think artists generally will be interested in it. But I think the key thing is history. The key theme is going back and looking at history. And I think we talked about Pin Pin and we talked about Snakeskin, which I haven't seen but I've read about. These filmmakers and films seem to be dealing with history, not necessarily nostalgia. And I think history and the impact of Singapore's history on the present is a key theme, absolutely key theme for artists, storytellers moving forward, and will continue to be, whether it uses nostalgia or not. Okay.
Thank you. So I guess we probably have Or
Sorry,
one last
Karen.
question. Yes.
No,
Hi,
it's not a
Huat.
question. It was it's a reaction to the
To-
entire talk. Thank
okay.
you very much for everybody sharing their nostalgic comments. I just think that Singapore has to own its own nostalgia. This is really a shout out to the filmmakers and also us as the audience. We've been talking about nostalgia being violating, being empowering, being memory and stuff like that. But I think bottom line, I mean, I'm glad that AFA is doing this kind of talks because we own our own nostalgia from the filmmaker's point of view and from the audience point of view. I just want to make that statement. And how do you preserve that utopian state is to continue supporting filmmakers in their art form and also understanding how difficult it is to make films and supporting filmmakers. You know, just a glance here, I'm just wondering how many of us in the audience have seen any local film recently in the cinemas, or have you just gone to watch Avengers, over, a Singapore film? I think, intellectual discourse is great, but let's ask ourselves really, really, if we want to own nostalgia as a Singapore artist, as a Singapore citizen, I think we have to support our nostalgia. Supporting the filmmakers, watching films, although they are bad and although they don't make money, yes, but we've got 7 million people here, so if we all watch films to relive our nostalgia, I think we can make it. That's all I just want to say. Thanks.
Okay. Oh, Southern. Okay. We'll do a quick one. Two comments here. Okay, so I'll be really quick, but I actually strongly disagree with the idea of owning nostalgia because nostalgia by its definition is exclusive. It's exclusive to people who live through that imagined history that we never had. All that we are heirs to that history that was basically a construct. And by that exclusive nature, we actually exclude all the people who cannot claim to be part of that nostalgia. All the newcomers, all the people who are not Singaporeans, all those who have never lived through that time, they are excluded from this narrative and myth-making of what the past is and what makes us truly authentic Singaporeans. So I think nostalgia is actually quite dangerous. I think we should look at films that discuss our history and the impact of history and myth-making in Singapore and how it affects the present, but that's not necessarily nostalgia. And I think if we look at it, it is actually a pretty dangerous and sorry, I'll pass it to you later. Pretty exclusive phenomenon that basically comes from people who are insecure about the future and who are not really sure what makes an authentic Singaporean identity. It's part of the codification of who we are. And a lot of it is about excluding others who we do not think are part of us.
But actually a bit on the note that you mentioned, Karen, about this post-SG50 thing, because you might have seen this little op-ed by a certain Sumiko Tan in the Straits Times a few weekdays ago, where she basically opines that nostalgia after all this SG thing it should be bunkum, and it's basically holding back the country from moving forward, which is an ironic statement given how much hagiography had taken place in that same period in which she was writing. But it does ring true to the extent that we have to ask, like what Chua mentioned, whether nostalgia or this obsession of it holds back or prevents you from taking a critical look at whatever stories you're telling, taking a critical look at the history or the story of the nation or the people whom you are looking at you're gazing at, and whether that becomes such a pervasive element that you can't tell a story, write a film, story, a play, or without tapping into nostalgia, which becomes again a straitjacket for, I think, a lot of creative people.
Of course you can. Unlucky Plaza has nothing nostalgic. Have you seen Unlucky Plaza? There's nothing nostalgic about Unlucky Plaza. And the other thing is actually quite interesting. I mean, as I said, it's not that easy to make a distinction between history and nostalgia. Not even historians themselves. The historiography of Singapore is a very contested field, especially of the 60s. we are really having a hard time struggling with who's telling the truth.
Okay,
Hi.
maybe we have to take one last question because we need to leave this hall. But we'll take that. Yes, that's right.
Oh, okay.
So we'll take that one last.
Okay,
yeah.
thank you for this. I just wanna. I think I disagree with the whole fact that nostalgia is exclusive. I mean, if other generation are able to actually feel the sentimentality for the 60s or 20s or whatever, then it's not really exclusive. And also for the fact that foreigners are able to feel nostalgic about other people's memories. I'm not Singaporean, but I actually could relate to a lot of the stories, given my different background. I think it's highly infectious in a way because it depicts a lot of relationships or transferable memories. And therefore, it's not so dangerous as it may seem, only if you actually just hold on to the past and forget on documenting the present. Then there will be a problem, but it's not nostalgia's problem, it's the person's problem. So yeah, that's all I can say. Thank you.
I just want to say one thing about Singapore film. I go to watch Singapore film as a matter of duty. And sometimes research. Good or bad.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you to the audience for participating. We would like to thank Filmgarde for being our venue sponsor this afternoon and for this place for us to have this really interesting conversation.